We move on now then to the question of Gibraltar. Ladies and gentlemen delegates, I now invite the Special Committee to begin its consideration of the question of the Gibraltar. Under this item, the Special Committee has before it a working document prepared by the Secretariat, which is contained in document AC/AC 109, 2014/12. Before we proceed, I would like to inform the committee that the delegation of Spain has indicated its wish to participate in the committee's deliberations on this item. And as you will recall, I informed the committee during our organizational meeting of 20 February of the wish of the delegation of Spain to participate as an observer in the 2014 session of the Special Committee as a whole. And I would also like to acknowledge the presence here today of the Chief Minister of Gibraltar and his delegation. And as always, they are most welcome at this committee. Before we hear their statements, would any delegation like to take the floor at this time, based on the working documents that you've already had a chance to peruse? I see no request for the floor then. We will move on directly, with the permission of the committee, to give the floor to the Chief Minister of Gibraltar to address the committee. Mr. Picardo, you have the floor, sir. You have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished delegates, firstly, many congratulations on your appointment to the chair of this important committee. As you know, Gibraltarian leaders have been addressing this committee in hope of your assistance since 1963. We therefore share the frustrations that you have expressed and those of the distinguished delegate from Cuba for a more ingenious approach to deliver progress for colonial people. Because for us, it is now over half a century of putting our argument for recognition of our right to self-determination and in parallel of desiring peaceful coexistence with our neighbor, Spain. After my address last year, your distinguished predecessor, His Excellency Señor Diego Modejon Pazmino, replied to my reference to this committee's continued silence on the issue of Gibraltar. He said that my suggestion that the committee was failing on Gibraltar's decolonization was unfair and that you have to adhere strictly to UN mandates, not on your sympathies for one side or another, to quote him. Señor Modejon Pazmino recognized that perhaps there was a need to review how the committee went about its work, but he said such a review must be done through the proper UN procedures. We cannot improvise, he said. Well, I can confidently tell you, Mr. Chairman, that you certainly have sufficient jurisdiction to start assisting us, as you are required to do by Articles 73 and 74 of the Charter and the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, adopted by General Assembly Resolution 1514, Roman 25, of the 14th of December 1960, and the rest of the underlying resolutions. Every year, we come here and remind you that these oblige you to act to protect our right to self-determination in delisting our nation. Every year, we have addressed every part of each one of the documents that deals with delisting and decolonization in erudite and learned speeches from my own distinguished predecessors. But every year, instead of seeing ourselves protected by you, instead of seeing you support us in making progress, we continue to be treated by your committee under successive chairmen to a deafening silence. I sincerely hope, Mr. Chairman, that you will seek to change that impasse. Because you must make no mistake, the sound of this committee's silence resonates through the generations of Gibraltarians who have been denied their right to emerge from the de jure colonialism that we have long escaped from de facto. The sound of your silence speaks to an organization no longer fit for purpose, no longer able to discharge the functions for which it was established in a harder but much more idealistic world, in the exciting times that have seen the numbers of people living in listed territories reduced from 750 million to just over 2 million. That, Mr. Chairman, is this committee's success, and also, in the 2 million of us that are left, its failure. Because perhaps most disappointingly, the sound of your silence is a siren call to those who wish to thwart the founding principles of the Charter and the Declaration, in a pernicious attempt to create a new doctrine of international law that treats territories subject to a sovereignty dispute in a way that is different to those who are not. Terrifyingly, what that is designed to do, Mr. Chairman, is to do away with the inalienable legal human rights of the 2 million people who remain in listed territories, exactly the people whose circumstances present the hard cases for whom such principles are created. And the fact is that Gibraltar's case would have been resolved and our nation delisted long ago, in keeping with the fourth option for decolonization, if it were not for the Spanish government's repeated attempt to block it. Mr. Chairman, Spain is a nation that has politically transformed everything about itself in these past 50 years, except for its attitude to Gibraltar. You must therefore be very wary, Mr. Chairman, of a nation of 48 million people with a territorial extension of over 500 million square kilometers that expends as much energy as Spain does in order to seek to colonize our beloved 6 square kilometers, the home of the 30,000 Gibraltarians. The crux of the matter is that the Spanish government's unsustainable insistence that although Gibraltar is in their view definitely a colonial territory, the Gibraltarians are not, in their view, a colonial people, able to avail ourselves of the rights and protections available to such peoples in the Charter and in other principles of international law. That argument is, of course, factually and legally fatally flawed at so many levels. It's almost not worth spending time countering it. But it is worth pointing out that it is actually jurisprudentially entirely contradictory for the Spanish government to come to this committee to ask you to approach the decolonization of a non-self-governing territory as if all that mattered was the status of the land in question. The fact is that the very principles underlying the rules and norms created to govern decolonization are not rules of international conveyancing. They are not rules that relate to title to the territories as pieces of land. They are rules designed to protect what are described in terms in the Charter, the Declaration, and the resolutions as inalienable rights of colonial people. These are therefore rights that relate not to territories, not to land, but to the people that inhabit them. It should therefore be clear to the Spanish government that the issues being considered in this committee on decolonization are exclusively the rights in personam, that are the personal rights attaching to the people of each of the territories on the list. And we, the Gibraltarian people, are undeniably a colonial people by dint of the fact that we are the non-self-governing population of the territory that is listed. Full stop. Because even the very categorization based on whether a territory is or is not non-self-governing is clearly a reference to the social and communal structure of governance of the people of such a territory. The rug on which the Spanish government's argument is based is that the territory and the people of Gibraltar are somehow divisible from each other. Yet once included on the list of non-self-governing territories, as we were 68 years ago in 1946, the land and the people of each of the territories becomes indistinct from each other, joined forever as the people exercise their in personam rights over the territory over which they are the only ones granted rights in rem by the Charter, the Declaration, and the resolutions. The moment of crystallization in which colonial people and territory are forever legally fused as one was the moment in 1946 that the UK listed us and the UN accepted us on the list. In other words, what the UN public international legal doctrine has joined in protection of the rights and wishes of the colonial people, no third state can now put asunder. Because you as a committee are set up as guardians of our rights as a people to self-determination. You are not a forum for the prosecution by any third parties, such as Spain, of their irredentist territorial claims. For that reason, let me be clear, Mr. Chairman, what you do not have jurisdiction to entertain is Spain's assertions and claims over our territory. Yet, that is what you actually do. And any time spent trying to invent new doctrines about sovereignty disputes being relevant to your work will never result in any new rule of international law that might somehow allow Spain to a backdoor towards the sovereignty of Gibraltar. I will, in any event, try to put it more simply than that. This committee is not established in the hierarchy of the United Nations or in international law as a body either competent or empowered to resolve territorial disputes. It is the International Court of Justice that is there for that. But as you know, and we have repeated ad nauseum, the Spanish government's bravado has never extended to elevating the territorial matters that they boldly and politically argue before you to the legal forum that is the ICJ. You should tell them to do so, because as the distinguished Honorable Joe Bossano told you in your successful seminar in Fiji last month, the Spanish arguments of 1964 and those of 2014 actually differ in nothing at all. The Spanish government haven't moved on, but the Gibraltar ship has sailed, and Spain needs to work that out, deal with it, and move on. Even in physical terms, we are now seeing the same problems at our frontier with Spain as we saw in 1964. At that time, Spain started imposing restrictions at the international frontier between our nations as part of the stated policy of trying to strangle us economically. In 2014, 50 years later, and now despite the fact that we are both part of the European Union, they use the same trumped-up excuses to impede traffic flow across the frontier. These are de facto economic sanctions which force thousands of Spanish workers, to queue for hours before returning home to Spain after a hard day's work in Gibraltar. In a detailed letter from the Deputy Chief Minister, Dr. Garcia, who accompanies me to your committee today, we have informed this and the Fourth Committee of Spain's actions and the repeated illegal incursions of her state vessels into British Gibraltar territorial waters in breach of UNCLOS. Spain makes mothers and children, the old, the infirm, they queue for hours as a result of the unnecessary, sporadic pedestrian controls imposed by Spain. There is no possible justification for their actions, despite even the most exaggerated concerns about the arbitrage in price in respect of some commodities. Gibraltar also suffers from undeclared imports, but all our controls are proportional and designed to avoid causing nuisance to peoples crossing the frontier between our nations. In taking disproportionate action, Spain stifles businesses, damages trade, and embitters human relations. She manages to make family life fraught with stress for those who have to cross the frontier to work or just to see loved ones. Almost every day, we see Spanish state vessels of its Navy or Guardia Civil make illegal incursions into our territorial sea, something which is actually worse now than it was 50 years ago. I have no doubt, Mr. Chairman, that one day a more modern Spanish administration will look back on such behavior with deep regret. Indeed, such measures do nothing to enhance the reputation of Spain in seeking temporary membership of the Security Council. And so, let us look at what it is that you can do to help us under the Charter, the Declaration and the resolutions which your predecessor referred to. Well, Mr. Chairman, you do have jurisdiction to visit Gibraltar. The rules allow you to do so. And even this morning, you have considered visiting missions under item 5 of your agenda. The United Kingdom, the administering power under your quaintly outdated nomenclature, has invited you to Gibraltar. We, the colonial people, have repeatedly invited you to Gibraltar. But you have not come. There has inexplicably been no visiting mission to Gibraltar. If you want to be able to say to me and the people of Gibraltar that you are at least doing what you have power to do, at least come to visit Gibraltar. You also clearly have jurisdiction as a UN NGO to opine or seek an advisory opinion on the progress towards a sufficient measure of self-government of the people of each territory. We have previously left copies of our 2006 Constitution with this committee. But you will not answer our repeated call for an opinion on whether that Constitution delivers to us a sufficient measure of self-government short of independence, so that we might seek to freely determine and consolidate our status under that Constitution as being our choice of tailor-made fourth option for decolonization as introduced by General Assembly Resolution 2625, Roman 25 of the 24th of October 1970. You have power to do that. We ask you to do so. But you neither opine, nor do you move to seek an advisory opinion. So the words of your predecessor as chairman last year, after my intervention, that you do what you can, are demonstrably unfair and untrue. It is obvious that there is much more you can do to help us, which you are not doing. This year, we are holding a symposium on self-determination after the summer. You have an obligation to promote that right in the null self-governing territories. Item 4 on your agenda today considered exactly that. So I hereby formally invite you, Mr. Chairman, to attend and speak at our symposium, and in that way promote the right in Gibraltar. If you are not available, we will welcome anyone from the Secretariat or any other representative of the committee to attend, and if you wish, also to speak and disseminate your message in our nation. Separately, I also invite you to organize your next seminar, so successfully held this year in Fiji, again, in Gibraltar. If you have already agreed a destination for the next seminar, Mr. Chairman, make it the one after that. But do come. Don't let Spain, that has no rights it can assert before you, put you off doing the things that you are empowered to do. And don't cower away from us. We don't bite. And if you don't do any of these things that you can do, then there is the evidence that you are wholly failing the people of Gibraltar, failing to fulfill your obligations under the solemn, sacred trust under which you are established. Indeed, I put it to you, Mr. Chairman, that you are even failing the Kingdom of Spain with your continued inaction. You see, if you at least told them that they cannot use this committee to seek to advance their predatory claim, that they should take it to the ICJ, if they believe in it, they might finally move on from their untenable position. That is why we are crystal clear in explaining our own position. We say clearly that Gibraltar will never be Spanish. We say clearly that we do not seek to be wooed for an eventual takeover that would amount to a recolonization, because no amount of wooing will ever persuade us to surrender our right to our land, or will ever make us forget the way in which we have been treated for over half a century. But we also, Mr. Chairman, say clearly that this does not dampen our desire for a mature, productive, and mutually beneficial dialogue as neighbors. We seek to respect Spain and to be respected by Spain as a friendly and permanently distinct neighbor who can work closely with our large neighbor to the north, as well as we already seek to do with our similar neighbor to the south. Indeed, Mr. Chairman, these are auspicious times in Spain. This week, a young Spanish prince with an international education will become king. To Felipe VI of Spain, Gibraltar offers a hand of friendship and respect as neighbors and supporters of democracy. This new head of state must know that we seek only peace, understanding, and cooperation. Let us never fall for the negative, destructive force of futile and puerile nationalism, which feeds no one but the dinosaurs who prefer to rerun the long-lost battles of yesterday. Let us prioritize dialogue. We remain strongly committed to the trilateral process of dialogue, as the United Kingdom has also repeatedly said that it is. And let us grab opportunities for such dialogue in a manner that does not compromise any attendant party. His Excellency Foreign Secretary Haig of the United Kingdom has been imaginative in seeking to avoid the pitfalls of lateralism by proposing a parallel ad hoc dialogue on matters of mutual interest, where the parties present would be those with relevant constitutional competences. Alongside our call for dialogue, Mr. Chairman, this committee should support the people of Gibraltar in all our endeavours in seeking our final delisting. Be ingenious, Mr. Chairman, as you have said you wish to be. Support us with the things that are in your power. A visit, attendance at our symposium, organisation of one of your next seminars in our territory, or even by seeking, at last, an advisory opinion from the ICJ on our right to self-determination. Support us, because that is what you are created to do. Or tell us why you won't, but without pretending that you can't. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your time. I am, of course, available to deal with any questions that you may have dealing with my intervention.
Gracias al señor Fabian Picardo.
Thank you to Mr. Fabian Picardo. I'd just like to say that I'm not going to get into the controversy. It would be a serious error that I would not be forgiven, nor could I forgive myself if I were able to have a committee that only had all the power to intervene and resolve all decolonization issues around the planet. I would not be able to chair a body that could unilaterally do so because it would be so dangerous. The imperialist, predatory vocation of such a committee as supporting brute force, if there were a committee such as that one, I would not be capable, Mr. Picardo, of being able to preside over a matter such as that. We are making an effort to hear our parties. It is our obligation to hear all parties' views. There's no negligence or indifference here. We don't have that vocation, Mr. Picardo. I have an obligation to hear all parties and to endeavor to govern and address the anxieties created by all these absurd conflicts and all the hypocrisy on the planet, on our planet right now, with regard to decolonization. Eradicating colonization, as I was saying at the beginning, we're already now in the third decade. If it were in our hands, we would be very dangerous if only us were responsible for eradicating colonization. We'd be colonizing other things, hypocritically. So please don't be so pessimistic with regard to the committee's work. We hear from all parties. We have enormous patience, and we are human beings. And we need to know to work patiently, Mr. Picardo. And I'm so pleased that you're here, and I would be pleased to continue seeing you, because I could say then you come to these fora in order to give your speech, as you have every right to do so. Because at some level, you do believe in this committee, and that's an important point. I'm attaching myself to that very tiny piece of faith that you are showing the committee by continuing to come to the committee and to speak with us on behalf of the United Nations, because I too have a national vision of these things, which I won't be stating because that would be irresponsible as well. The harshest and strongest words that you pronounce I understand, and I recognize your right to say them. But I will be processing them as a representative of the United Nations with a plural effort, with an effort of diversity. I do not always believe what the other person says, but I'm going to respect their right to say it, despite not believing in what they're saying, because everyone has the right to speak their truth. But we're not all stuck on the same point. We don't all have the same point of view. But it would be irrespectful of your right to say that you cannot say what you want to say because you're in the position that you're in, or have taken that position. So please remember, you're always welcome to the committee, Mr. Picardo. Now, I'd like to give the floor, and this was anticipated, to the representative of Spain. As always, according to the logic used here, we try to set up a stage where everyone has a right to speak their mind. You have the floor. To the delegate of Spain.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, sir. This session of the Special Committee takes place after the recent regional seminar on decolonization, which was held in Fiji on the 21st to the 23rd of May. An opportunity was afforded to us at that time to assess, as a whole, the progress of the work carried out within the framework of the Third International Decade of the Eradication for Colonialism. Therefore, allow me to take this opportunity to once again thank the government of Fiji for its hospitality and excellent organization of the event. Mr. Chairman, Spain has always defended the idea, in full compliance with the doctrine of this committee, that the different situations under the committee must be addressed on a case-by-case basis, seeking pragmatic solutions whenever possible, provided that such a task be undertaken in keeping with UN doctrine and that the relevant solutions in each case, which is the result of the examination they have been subject to for many years. In addition, Spain has always maintained that, except for where there is a conflict with the rights of another state, the opinion of the population is an important factor in the path to decolonization. In such cases, my country believes that the time has come for territories subject to decolonization and administrating powers to initiate a dialogue aimed at breaking up or transforming colonial links in the shortest possible time, in accordance with the United Nations criteria. In certain cases, however, it is the inhabitants of the territory who, in agreement with the colonial power and with their economic stability guaranteed, give up their political independence. These are cases of colonialism by consent, as it's called, that seeks to perpetuate itself, regardless of the criteria of the committee. This is completely unacceptable. This assumption is especially problematic when attempting to maintain the status quo at the expense of the legitimate rights of another state and at the expense of the original inhabitants of the colony, as has been occurring in cases such as that of Gibraltar, which is the one that directly interests my country. Mr. Chairman, Gibraltar was occupied by Great Britain on behalf of the third party. It was artificially populated in numerous ways with persons brought from other locations, and if that were not enough, it was enlarged with land wrested illegally from Spain at a later stage. The occupation took place in 1704 on behalf of Archduke Charles of Austria, pretender to the Spanish crown, within the context of the Spanish War of Succession. The populating of the colony, planned by the occupier, took place well after the conquest. The Spanish who lived in Gibraltar until 1704, the real Gibraltarians, were forced to leave the territory and to settle in the neighboring town of San Roque. Its town council has since then been called the Town Council of the town of Gibraltar in San Roque. This produced a fracture in the region that survives to this day. Furthermore, the United Kingdom illegally seized other territories, which were not ceded under the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713 that ended the above-mentioned War of Spanish Succession. This treaty clearly defines the areas ceded to the United Kingdom. Only the town and castle of Gibraltar were ceded together with its port, with its internal waters exclusively. Fortifications and forts that were belonging were also ceded. Spain did not cede territorial waters. What the United Kingdom describes as, quote, illegal incursions in British waters are simple routine activities of Spanish ships in Spanish waters. Regarding the isthmus that separates the rock from the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, it also was not ceded under the Treaty of Utrecht. What happened was that in the 20th century, for humanitarian reasons, Spain allowed the United Kingdom to establish temporary camps to avoid the spread of a yellow fever epidemic among the population of the rock. The epidemic passed, but far from appreciating Spain's humanitarian gesture, the British did not leave. To the contrary, despite Spain's protests, these settlements on Spanish soil became permanent. In 1909, the United Kingdom built a fence, delimiting the area and trying to thereby consolidate their illegal occupation of the Spanish territory. Under no criteria would it be realistic to assume and base initiatives on the hypothesis that the government of Spain could ever accept the perpetuation of the current situation in which the administrating power and the colony seek to ignore Spain's legitimate rights under the Treaty of Utrecht and under the doctrine of the United Nations. Mr. Chairman, on many occasions, this organization has recognized the specific nature of Gibraltar's decolonization process by stating that the colonial situation of Gibraltar undermines the territorial integrity of Spain. This was stated in General Assembly Resolution 2353 of 19 December 1967. Furthermore, the administrating power itself admits that the independence of its colony is not possible without Spain's consent, in accordance with the aforementioned Treaty of Utrecht. These two factors, Mr. Chairman, are more than sufficient reasons to consider that for the decolonization of Gibraltar, a negotiated solution is required. Indeed, Mr. Chairman, the General Assembly has spent more than 4 decades calling upon the administrating power and Spain to resolve all their differences around this issue. The United Nations asks for a solution to be negotiated bilaterally between Spain and the United Kingdom. Year after year, the General Assembly adopts by consensus a decision that contains this mandate to hold a bilateral dialogue. The decision defines the framework within which that negotiated solution must be reached. That is, the Spanish-British Declaration made in Brussels on 27 November 1984, leading a few months later to the so-called Brussels process. In this regard, Spain insists that the solution involves restitution of territory that is one ceded under the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713, as well as a territory that was later illegally occupied by the United Kingdom without any legal basis, particularly the isthmus and the surrounding waters. Mr. Chairman, I would like to reiterate this point. The United Kingdom occupied wrongfully areas under Spanish sovereignty in violation of international law, areas to which Spain has never ceased to lay claim. Spain vindicates the resumption of this bilateral dialogue with the United Kingdom, in which the issues of sovereignty, which are plural, must be dealt with. The President of the Government of Spain reiterated this call in his intervention before the United Nations General Assembly in September of 2012, and again in 2013 in the same forum. Spain would like to state once again that despite the mandate of the United Nations and the commitment made by the United Kingdom in the Brussels Declaration of 1984, these negotiations have not been taking place for some years now, and this is not at all due to a lack of will on Spain's part. The responsibility for this failure falls squarely on the administrating power for which for too many years has been refusing to even talk about Spain about the future of Gibraltar. Mr. Chairman, due to past experiences, Spain is certain that both states would be able to find creative formulas to resolve their differences, taking into account the interests of the present inhabitants of the colony. This is the message that has been sent time and again to the authorities of the United Kingdom at the highest levels, and which I wish to convey here once again, despite the fact that during the past year, since the last meeting of the Special Committee, Spain's difficulties with this colony have increased. The origin of the tension goes back to March 2012, when the recently elected local authorities of Gibraltar decided to stop applying the informal agreement reached in 1999 by the authorities of the Rock and the Spanish Fishermen's Associations. The tension was exacerbated last summer when on the 24th and 25th of July 2013, the local authorities of Gibraltar decided, also unilaterally, to drop close to 70 concrete blocks into the Bay of Algeciras in waters that Spain considers to be its own and which have traditionally been a fishing ground for Spanish fishermen. To all this we must add the continuation, also since last summer, of works to fill the eastern side of the rock to build an artificial wharf within the framework of a policy of territorial expansion which Spain has denounced. Moreover, Mr. Chairman, we note that, unfortunately, apart from mere rhetorical statements, Gibraltar local authorities are not properly cooperating in combating all forms of illicit trafficking, in particular tobacco smuggling, which is becoming a serious problem. For example, the amount of packs of cigarettes seized at the fence between 2010 and 2012 rose by 213%. Between 2012 and 2013, smuggling rose by 53%. A final example to illustrate the lack of cooperation. On the 24th of April 2014, an officer from the Guardia Civil del Mar, Civil Guard of the Sea, was injured as a result of clash with the Royal Gibraltar Police, just when the Guardia Civil was arresting a boat smuggling tobacco. This lack of cooperation in the fight against smuggling and the increase in smuggling, as the figures shows, forces us to intensify our surveillance in the waters and the fronts. Mr. Chairman, the European Commission itself has clearly stressed in a report published on 15 November 2013 that contrary to what the UK claims, the checks carried out by Spain do not violate European Union legislation. The European Commission has always also acknowledged the problem brought about by the rise in tobacco smuggling and requested the UK to improve its fight against illicit trafficking of different sorts. When conducting the checks at the fence, which are mandatory for Spain in order to fulfill its obligation vis-à-vis its EU partners, we always endeavor to cause as little inconvenience as possible to the inhabitants of both sides of the fence and carry them out in accordance with the principles of non-discrimination, proportionality, and randomness. Mr. Chairman, I would like to provide a few more examples of the pillars of the economic and social model of Gibraltar, which speak for themselves and which provide an indication of what has been created in the rock. Gibraltar has no natural resources, but it is the fourth largest economy in the world in per capita income terms. With a population of approximately 30,000 people, there are strikingly around 30,000 registered companies in Gibraltar. The Gibraltar local authorities still permit bunkering actions, which is supplying oil from ship to ship out in the sea, through floating gas stations, which is an enormous environmental hazard in such a transited area as the Strait of Gibraltar. Regarding Gibraltar's tax system, Spain considers the company tax regime for extraterritorial companies in Gibraltar, established by its income tax law of 2010, violates EU state aid rules and therefore has decided to file a case against that regime before the European Commission. On the basis of the case filed by Spain, the European Commission decided in October 2013 to open a formal investigation. In this regard, it should be pointed out that in 2011, the European Court of Justice ruled in favor of Spain and the European Commission against Gibraltar 2002 corporate taxation policy on grounds similar to those now being considered. Mr. Chairman, to sum up, the unilateral and provocative attitude of the Gibraltar local authorities, while the administrating power of the UK idly stands by, is inconveniencing the inhabitants both of Gibraltar and the Campo de Gibraltar, and it makes it even more urgent to put an end to this colonial situation. In any event, despite the impasse of the aforementioned Brussels process, and despite the reiterated unilateral and provocative acts of the Gibraltar local authorities, my country reiterates its goodwill by engaging in regional cooperation in order to create a constructive atmosphere of mutual trust and cooperation for the benefit and prosperity of Campo de Gibraltar and Gibraltar. Such regional cooperation must set aside the issues of sovereignty and jurisdiction that pertain exclusively to Spain and the United Kingdom, as required by the doctrine of this organization. Spain drove forward the Forum of Dialogue on Gibraltar in 2004 as an initiative aimed at promoting cooperation to benefits the citizens of Campo de Gibraltar and Gibraltar, and from the Spanish side to create an atmosphere of greater trust in which the issues of sovereignty could be negotiated at the right moment and with greater guarantees of success. In 2010, the forum was hampered because of the insistence by the Gibraltar local authorities of using conversations on technical and local cooperation issues in order to advance their claims in matters of sovereignty. Mr. Chairman, the Spanish government has made it clear that it does not accept such a use of an instrument of regional cooperation, which, additionally, was greatly imbalanced, as it did not contemplate the participation of Spanish local and regional authorities, but it did include those of Gibraltar. Consequently, in line with the last consensus decision adopted by the General Assembly in December of 2013, we are attempting to reach an agreement with the United Kingdom on a new regional cooperation framework, dealing exclusively with issues that directly affect the cooperation between inhabitants on both sides of the fence. This new framework envisages the participation of not only Spain and the United Kingdom, but also of the Gibraltar local authorities, and as opposed to the now existing trilateral forum of the competent Spanish local and regional authorities. Mr. Chairman, in summary, all of the differences between my country and the administrating power of the territory related to the issues of sovereignty and jurisdiction must be addressed and resolved through bilateral negotiations, as indicated by the reiterated mandate of the United Nations, which is inspired by the work of the Special Committee on Decolonization. Spain would like to highlight once again the importance it grants to the work of the Special Committee and to the need to respect procedure established by this organization on matters of decolonization. For these reasons, Spain urges the Special Committee to not allow that, with arguments alien to the doctrine established by the UN, territories that have not been decolonized in accordance with the requirements of the Committee are removed from the list of non-self-governing territories to be colonized. Spain trusts that under the competent stewardship of the Committee, the progress needed for the decolonization of Gibraltar, in light of the relevant resolutions of the General Assembly and the applicable principles, can be achieved. Thank you very much.
Doy las gracias.
Thank you to the distinguished representative of Spain for that statement. Distinguished delegates, in keeping with the request for a hearing approved by the committee at the beginning of today's session, I would like to invite Mr. Denis Mathews of the Group for Self-Determination of Gibraltar to take a seat at the petitioner's table. I now give the floor. You have the floor, Mr. Mathews.
Mr. Chairman, I would first of all like to congratulate you on your appointment as chairman of this distinguished committee, and I would also like to thank you for the opportunity you have afforded me of addressing this committee. The Self-Determination for Gibraltar Group, of which I am chairman, has been in existence for almost 25 years, and it was set up to seek recognition of Gibraltar's right to self-determination, leading to decolonization and delisting. All Gibraltarians subscribed to democratic principles, and based on that premise, I can safely say that all Gibraltarians are convinced that we have the right to self-determine our political future and that of our land. And during the last quarter of a century, we have made considerable progress in achieving recognition of this right, not least, of course, here at the United Nations itself. Over the more than 300 years that Gibraltar has been British, there has been a gradual progression culminating in our 2006 Constitution, which has brought about a level of self-government which, in the view of Her Majesty's Government of the United Kingdom and others, has already established a decolonized status for Gibraltar. This may well be so, Mr. Chairman, but regrettably, we have been unable up till now to elicit an opinion from any body here at the United Nations as to whether this view is correct or not, and if it is not, what changes might need to be made to achieve decolonization. This in spite of the fact that a copy of our present Constitution was presented to this very committee asking precisely for an opinion on whether it met your decolonization criteria or not. And this has been followed up by repeated requests for an opinion by Gibraltar delegations, all of which have fallen on deaf ears. We naturally find this extremely disappointing, and I have to ask myself why this is so, Mr. Chairman. Why is your committee unwilling or unable to make a move or even a comment to help guide Gibraltar towards decolonization? In any event, Mr. Chairman, I would like to say that I am somewhat puzzled by the decolonization fervor which seems to grip certain sectors of the United Nations with declarations about final decades of decolonization, with the present one being the third one, by the way, which would seem to give a great urgency to the process of decolonization, but which appears to come to an abrupt standstill when it comes to the question of Gibraltar, which seems to have been relegated by this committee and others at the UN to a state of limbo. The fact is, Mr. Chairman, that colonial empires ceased to exist a long time ago. Excluding Western Sahara, which is a case on its own, what are we talking about here in the context of the final decade of decolonization? We are talking about a number of mostly island communities ranging in population from the 210,000 of French Polynesia to a population of just 50 in Pitcairn. I do not believe that any of these communities are being exploited or are having their resources plundered to enrich their administering states, as so often happened in the shameful era of the great colonial empires, and which would justify the UN's expressions of urgency for their decolonization. In fact, I would venture to suggest that the boot is now on the other foot, and that it is these small communities that are all now, in some measure, dependent on their administering state, whether it be in terms of defense, foreign affairs, economic aid, or any other area. And it is right that this should be so, Mr. Chairman. I believe that it is right that the old colonial empires, having taken so much from their colonies in the past, should now give something back to those small territories that need it. However, I believe that it is still of paramount importance that those territories that have a genuine desire to achieve a decolonized status, such as Gibraltar, should be given by this committee all the assistance required to achieve this objective in keeping with your UN mandate. In this context, Mr. Chairman, I have to tell you that the position of this committee and the Special Political and Decolonization Committee, the fourth committee, appears to me to be both illogical and contradictory. Article 1 of Chapter 1 of the United Nations Charter, which sets out the purposes of the United Nations, in point 2 states, and I quote, "to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples." This principle, as we all know, was ratified and further clarified by way of Section 2 of Resolution 1514-15, which states, and I quote, "all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Furthermore, Resolution 2231-21 itself recalls and demands implementation of Resolution 1514-15, thereby confirming application of the right of self-determination to all non-self-governing territories. It should be clear to everyone by now that there is no prospect of progress on Gibraltar's decolonisation on the basis of bilateral negotiations as suggested by the Spanish representative here between the United Kingdom and Spain, and that the way ahead for Gibraltar's decolonisation has to be by application of the principle of self-determination. The administering state has recognised this in our constitution and made it clear that no other course of action is acceptable. To make its position absolutely clear, in 2008, Jim Murphy, the United Kingdom Minister of State for Europe, stated, and I quote, "The UK government will never is a seldom used word in politics, enter into an agreement on sovereignty without the agreement of the government of Gibraltar and their people. In fact, we will never even enter into a process without that agreement." The word never sends a substantial and clear commitment and has been used for a purpose. We have delivered that message with confidence to the peoples and the governments of Gibraltar and Spain. It is a sign of the maturity of our relationship now that that is accepted as the UK's position. This position is endorsed and subscribed to by all the main political parties in the United Kingdom, which have all made it clear that they will not enter into any sovereignty negotiations over Gibraltar with which Gibraltar is not content. The situation is thus crystal clear, Mr. Chairman. The people of Gibraltar have the right to self-determination in accordance with UN doctrine, and this right is unequivocally supported by the administering state, which is not even prepared to consider sovereignty negotiations unless it is with Gibraltar's consent, which, as I am sure you're aware, Mr. Chairman, is never going to come. This position was further confirmed last year on our National Day by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Mr. David Cameron, who stated in a message transmitted to the people of Gibraltar, and I quote, "The British government wholeheartedly supports your right to determine your political future. As I have said before, we will never agree to any transfer of sovereignty or even start a process of negotiation of sovereignty without your consent." And this, as I see it, is where the inherent contradiction in the UN position comes in. Our undeniable right to self-determine the future of our land means that it is us, the Gibraltarians, in consultation with the administering state, who must arrive at an acceptable decolonized status for Gibraltar. This is self-evident and supported by UN doctrine, and so I fail to see how any person or committee can suggest that Spain has any role to play in this process. Yet the fourth committee has called upon the governments of the United Kingdom and Spain to negotiate an end to the colonial situation of Gibraltar, presumably in compliance with General Assembly resolutions, which are now half a century old and completely out of step with modern thinking in the 21st century, except, I suppose, in Spain. I find this proposal emanating from a body like the UN abhorrent, and it is impossible to comprehend how the UN can come up with such a proposal which reduces our people to insignificant pawns with negotiations carried out over our heads, thereby ignoring our right to self-determination and apparently wishing to condemn our people to a permanent state of colonialism by a country which has no respect for us and which has over many years subjected our people to all kinds of pressure and bullying and harassment and hardship. Given the above, Mr. Chairman, it must be clear to everyone by now that there is no prospect of progress on Gibraltar's decolonisation on the basis of bilateral negotiations between the United Kingdom and Spain. All of the main political parties in the United Kingdom have expressed in unequivocal terms that they respect the right of the people of Gibraltar to decide their own future and that of their land, and this right is enshrined in our Constitution, which is as it should be. It is the only honourable and ethical position to take. I do not believe for one moment that anyone carrying out an unbiased study of Gibraltar's history since 1704 and assessing how our community has grown and developed its own unique identity can argue that we do not have the right to assert that this is our land. It is the home of the Gibraltarians, and it is about time that after more than 300 years, and having entered into several treaties on Gibraltar, Spain accepted that this is so and moved on like so many other countries in Europe and elsewhere which have lost parts of their territory during the course of these 300 years and in time have accepted their loss. It is worth reiterating, Mr. Chairman, that apart from the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713, where Spain yielded to the Crown of Great Britain the propriety of Gibraltar, and I quote, to be held and enjoyed absolutely with all manner of right forever, without any exception or impediment whatsoever, there are several other treaties where Spain recognized British sovereignty over Gibraltar. The most important of these was the Treaty of Versailles of 1783, which is of particular interest in this context. Spain, as a victorious ally of the United States in the War of American Independence, could have insisted on the return of Gibraltar. But in November 1782, Spain let it be known that if she were offered not only Minorca, but also the whole of Florida in exchange for her claim on Gibraltar, she would give up her claim. So, under the Treaty of Versailles, England handed over to Spain Minorca and the whole of Florida. Today, Minorca is still a Spanish possession, and as regards Florida, in 1819, by terms of the Adams-Onis Treaty, Spain ceded Florida to the United States in exchange for $5 million, the equivalent of which today is $168 million. Thus, Spain walked away from the Treaty of Versailles with a very advantageous settlement, Minorca and $168 million. However, Spanish policy is always to secure as much as it can get by giving whatever assurances are required and then renege on these assurances and come back to demand more. Today, she completely ignores the agreement to give up the claim to our land and now wants Britain to hand over Gibraltar also. So Spain, having profited hugely from the arrangements under the Treaty of Versailles and having relinquished the opportunity to recover Gibraltar, is not prepared to abide by treaty terms and now insists on trying to take over our land also. This disregard for treaty agreements does not sit well with the preamble to the UN Charter, Mr. Chairman, which, as I am sure you know, lays down as one of its aims, and I quote, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. Well, I am afraid that the UN has singularly failed to impress upon Spain that it has obligations arising from treaties relating to Gibraltar, and Spain's unwillingness to agree to seek a legal opinion on Gibraltar's right to self-determination, as proposed by Gibraltar's representatives on more than one occasion, is in itself a striking admission of the weakness of its case. However, although all these treaties give Great Britain an incontestable legal right to Gibraltar, what is to my mind even more important in this day and age are the rights of peoples. During the over 300 years that Gibraltar has been British, a homogeneous community has grown on our rock, descended from Maltese, Genoese, Portuguese, English, and other races. Over those intervening 3 long centuries, all these peoples have coalesced to create a palpably unique identity, which is at the heart of today's Gibraltarianism. At the same time, we have progressed politically with our own parliament and democratic system of government, and Gibraltar has now been British for much longer than it was ever Spanish. However, the government of Spain disregards all of this and tries to circumvent our clear and inalienable right to self-determination by arguing that the issue of Gibraltar should be resolved by application of the principle of territorial integrity. This argument is quite clearly completely untenable. In precisely Resolution 1514(15), from which I have quoted above on the right to self-determination, it is also stated that, and I quote, any attempt aimed at the partial or total disruption of the national unity and the territorial integrity of a country is incompatible with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. But it is clearly ridiculous for anyone to now say that there is today an attempt aimed at the disruption of the territorial integrity of Spain in the context of Gibraltar, which has not been Spanish for 310 years. Apart from this, what is much more important is the fact that under the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht, Spain yielded to the Crown of Great Britain the propriety of Gibraltar forever. Now, Mr. Chairman, Spain agreed to give Gibraltar up forever in 1713. So where does the question of territorial integrity come in 300 years later? As a retired school teacher, I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, that I have known young children to give away a toy to another child and then throw a tantrum because they want it back the next day. However, I am sure we're not basing ourselves on the behavior of young children here, and neither is Gibraltar a toy that can be bandied about at whim. It is a community of 30,000 people which over the last 3 centuries has, like the rest of Europe, developed its own manifest identity, which is tangible and evident to anyone who wishes to visit our rock. And it is about time that Spain recognized that the people of Gibraltar have, over these 3 centuries, established unquestionable rights over this land of ours, and that we do not want it taken over by Spain. I ask you, Mr. Chairman, how long should it take for the inhabitants of a territory to be able to say, this is our land? 2 or 3 decades? Half a century? 100 years? Because we have existed as a people for much longer than that, and I do not therefore believe that anyone can realistically deny in this 21st century that Gibraltar is the land of the Gibraltarians, and that decisions as to its future can only be taken by our people in consultation, of course, with the administering state, but with no Spanish say in the matter or involvement of any kind. Given all of the above, Mr. Chairman, any reasonable person would expect Spain to have abandoned or at least shelved its claim to Gibraltar based on respect for democratic principles. I believe there are 2 reasons why Spain has not done so. The first is that for Spain, a country of over 40 million people, it is very easy to bully and harass Gibraltar, which is a territory with 30,000 inhabitants, and so it does so on a regular basis, something that Spain would not dare to do if Gibraltar were a much larger territory with a correspondingly larger population. When such harassment and bullying takes place, the international community merely looks on, and the administering state mostly confines itself to diplomatic protests which Spain simply ignores. The second reason is that the Spanish government finds it convenient to use Gibraltar as a distraction whenever there are internal problems and unrest in the country. The present situation is a glaring example of this. Spain has huge economic problems, the highest unemployment rate in the whole of the European Union, and terrible corruption scandals that engulf the whole country, from municipal councils to the highest levels of the central government, and even involving members of the royal family. And these have led to calls in the Spanish Parliament and from popular demonstrations for the President of the government to resign, which of course he refuses to do, although sections of the Spanish press assert that in any other European country he would have done so a long time ago. But corruption in Spain's political class is endemic, Mr. Chairman, and corruption spreads like a virus and manifests itself wherever corrupt politicians are able to operate. And this has led to complete disillusionment and loss of faith in their politicians amongst the large majority of Spaniards.
Señor Mathews.
Mr. Mathews? I'd like to apologize, but all right. Maybe put your headphone on. I would call upon you for your understanding and ask that we not begin discussion of domestic issues of another country. That's why I'm interrupting you, sir. I just ask that we focus our discussion on the subject at hand and not qualify domestic politics of another country.
Que no quiere que digan poca vergüenza de que no quiere que digan poca vergüenza de España.
I understand, Mr. Chairman. But I was just going to say that this is not what I'm saying. This is quoting the Spanish media and opinion polls in Spain. But I'll skip to my next bit. Despite all the negative propaganda against Gibraltar, based on lies and misinformation, many people are not so easily fooled, and the Spanish government's campaign against Gibraltar is seen for what it is: a politically motivated attempt to try and coerce our people into giving up the sovereignty of our land. Moreover, there are well-informed and prominent people in Spain who are familiar with the issue of Gibraltar and our territorial waters, which Spain refuses to recognize, and who make it clear publicly that they do not share their government line on these matters. I will mention some important examples of this thinking. The first is Señor José Antonio Iturriaga Barberán, a retired Spanish ambassador and former senior diplomat who once headed the legal section of the Spanish Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Madrid. He has declared publicly, on more than one occasion, that Gibraltar has the right under international law to claim up to 12 miles of territorial sea and the air above it, and that if this issue is taken to an international court, Spain will lose. Another example is Señor Luis Pérez Prat Durban, who is the Dean of the Law Faculty at the Olavide University of Seville and a former advisor to governments of the Partido Socialista Obrero Español and the Partido Popular, the two main political parties in Spain. He declared in a press interview in Spain that international law supported the right to self-determination and that the people of Gibraltar should be free to choose their own future regardless of Spain's claim. Professor Pérez Prat went on to say that he thinks that although not formally accepted, internally the Spanish government has accepted that Gibraltar will never be Spanish. A third example is Señor Manuel Chávez, who was president of the autonomous region of Andalusia for 18 years and also Labour minister and Vice President of the Spanish government. After castigating the Pepe government for their repressive policies against Gibraltar, he declared to the reporter interviewing him on the 14th of May this year, and I quote, "Neither you, nor I, nor our children or grandchildren are going to see a Spanish rock, because in the end, that has to be decided by the actual Gibraltarians." One final example, Mr. Chairman, if I may. His Royal Highness King Juan Carlos of Spain declared some years ago that Spain did not really want Gibraltar because if Gibraltar were given back to Spain, it would mean giving up Ceuta and Melilla, the two Spanish enclaves on the North African coast. So there you have it, Mr. Chairman, the comments of a few of the considerable number of prominent Spaniards who support the rights of the people of Gibraltar, which your committee seems reluctant to do anything about, even though the preamble to the Charter of the UN states, and I quote, "To reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small." Finally, Mr. Chairman, let me ask you whether there is anyone on this distinguished committee, you yourself or one of the vice chairmen or any other member, who is willing to engage with Gibraltar's representatives to tell us what we need to do to elicit some kind of response from this committee on how to progress Gibraltar's decolonization. Or perhaps, as the Chief Minister has already said, you might organize a visiting mission to Gibraltar, as this committee is obliged to do. Or is this asking for too much, Mr. Chairman? I have appended a summary of what I regard as the main facts of Gibraltar's position, together with an addendum which I trust members will peruse at their leisure. I would once again thank you for granting me the opportunity to address you.
Gracias.
Thank you, sir, Mr. Mathews, for addressing this committee on decolonization. And now, following Mr. Mathews' statement, I would like to ask the room if anyone would like to take the floor to ask a question or make a comment. The floor is open.
No hay pedidos de...
I see no request for the floor. Once again, thank you, Mr. Mathews, for your statement. You know our procedures that we've used a few times already. So I would ask that you now withdraw, please, so that we can continue our work. But I'd like to reiterate my gratitude to you for coming and addressing the committee. You may withdraw now, sir.
Señores
Distinguished delegates, continuing with our agenda, and in accordance with the committee's established methods of work, and taking into account our deliberations, I would like to suggest that the committee continue its consideration of the question of Gibraltar at its next session. Issues have not been exhausted here, and this would be subject to any directives which the General Assembly may wish to give at its 69th session. So again, I suggest that all the new elements be forwarded on to the General Assembly during this session. And we will transmit all relevant documentation and information on this matter. If I hear no objection, I will take it that the committee wishes to proceed in this matter. I hear no objection. I will take it that the committee wishes to do so. It is so decided.